Sorry, LinkedIn, it was a bit of a technical issue here, so we'll start again. And as I was saying, I met Cynthia through one of our advisors, Ed Keller, who recommended me to speak to her as a good entry point for getting to know the US market. And before I continue saying anything, I think Cynthia can maybe introduce herself, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, good morning or good afternoon. So happy to be here. I'm Cynthia Evans, and I work in global technology, data, analytics, insights, whatever it takes within the WPP organization and Wavemaker specifically. It's a large family.
How long have you been within Wavemaker and Group M?
A long time. I moved to Wavemaker, or its predecessor, the Media Edge, about 1998. And prior to that, I had spent time in the research side of the business with MRI, Arbitron/Nielsen now. So it's been a wonderful journey of learning.
I can imagine. I have three topics I wanted to talk to you about today. And one of them was to scale insights and scale strategy. Because, I mean, a lot of the customers you work with, I mean, yes, you are based in the US, but you're working across the globe. So how do you scale the gathering of insights? How do you make sure that you are getting the data that you need to then be able to take those informed decisions or give advice to your market?
That's such a good question. But there's a question that comes before that. And that is, what is an observation and what is an insight? Which leads to ultimately trends. So in terms of scaling, it takes a community of people still, maybe a little AI on the side, to really find an insight, because while there are universal findings, much of what is truly an insight, and in advertising, that's about touching the heart of your consumer, that varies by culture, by country, by generation. So scaling it is finding simply the nuggets or the little bits that will operate in multiple countries. And some of them are very macro. Food is a good category. Mobility of food that we eat has increased and increasingly operates everywhere in some form of handheld, comestible foodstuff. And that was not so much the case, say, even 20 years ago. There were rapid service restaurants and there were street food. But in terms of observation, or perhaps an insight, I'm very respectful of that difference between observations and insights. The handheld and the mixing of menus. There, for just a really kind of silly example, but there is a form of meat pie in almost every country.
All right.
Except those that tend to be vegetarian.
Yeah.
And it goes by a different name. It could be tacos, arepas, Natchitoches meat pies in the southern part of the US. So it's those fundamental insights that, from a marketing standpoint, are best to scale. Otherwise, you're looking at not scaling, you're looking at translating. It's my view on it. Another and most universal, of course, beauty, wanting to look your best.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not particularly an insight, again, it's an observation, but one of the universal across all countries is the increase in the male population that is recognizing the benefits of what Charles Revson originally said about beauty. So that's just a couple of examples.
And how do you go about finding these general observations? What type of data points do you normally look
Now
for, or
data
is it?
points. Well, I think we all know one of the best, and you are the right on the pulse of this one, is search. What people search out is what they're interested in. And so search keywords becomes one of the most important of the elements. But others, it's about listening, and that is listening to data more than anything else. Now you say, how do you listen to data? It's on a spreadsheet. Well, it's just a translation. It's someone told me one time the key element of understanding an insight is to understand if it's bigger or smaller. That is, on a spreadsheet, is the number bigger or smaller? Without getting into any of the very elegant mathematics and formulas that we've brought to the table in the search for insights, it's about finding what is bigger and what is smaller and what's the same.
And how do you, I mean, looking at what's smaller, what's bigger, how do you look for what might be the next trend? What are you trying to spot when looking for the next trend? Because I mean, when
Oh,
you're planning
next
a campaign
trend.
or you're helping, I mean, you know that probably the work you're doing now is something that's not going to go live until, say, a year later or 6 months later. So how do you plan so much ahead?
Yes, it still takes time for the creative to develop. I don't think there's any golden rule on this one. If the trend is going up, then something unexpected happens. And we saw this, the most obvious example is the world experience with COVID. Everything was looking rosy. We had behavior patterns. Consumers were doing things. They were interested in things. And then there was an external event that changed the landscape entirely. And so, in a very simplistic form, it's looking at what's trending up. One of the interesting things I've noticed is the word insight itself. There is no translation for that particular word in many of our languages. And so simply the word insight is to some degree like the word computer, which is living or being translated into a similar word, but there is no ultimate word. The Spanish language group is one of the main ones. Insight
Hmm.
doesn't exist except as a concept. There's not a single word that really describes it.
Hmm.
And some people may disagree with me, and we've experimented with a lot of them. But it's more about being willing to ask why at the very end of the day. Just keep asking why, like a small child would.
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of times questions from users in the platform My Telescope that the hard part they find is like the entry point when you're doing research. Like how do I know that I'm asking the right question?
You don't. Only tracking and following the conversation and being adaptable. You know, one of the translations into the more modern data form of talking about insights is data signals. And
What do you mean by
that is
that?
perhaps a more proper way to think about it. You receive data signals from all kinds of databases, and it's looking at the signals and then having some critical thinking about it to bring it into a finding. You know, the rules of the road haven't changed. You can go back to many eons. It's looking for signals, thinking about it, and then asking why, and then what would that mean? And I'm not a particularly woke person. However, which is one of the kind of current trends in the US, but I do think there is this just magnificent opportunity for all of us to keep asking why and look for the meaning. And then we have to think about it. You know, in critical thinking is one of the curriculum areas that is often discussed now in the US, at
Mhm.
least. And the idea that it's teaching or helping people understand if, then, what, which can be programmed as well into
Yeah.
AI, which is the very fundamental level. Of course, the programming is a billion times beyond anything I would ever understand, but it's if, then, what?
And the question, how have you done, I mean, with this question, with the if then what a question mindset, how have you done, for example, because I know you've been using search for quite a long time to understand markets and movement and trends. How do you do that? Because I mean, the keywords per se are just keywords. How do you get to, how do you dig deeper into that so that you can answer those questions
You know, one
from the
of
search signals?
my first cuts of data when I'm really thinking about finding, you know, what may be happening is to compare. This is really simple. It's not mathematical or anything, but compare a word cloud from a social buzz monitoring with the word cloud from a search instance, because it's the difference in what people are searching for and what they're saying. And you could make a case that if you start with what they're saying or talking about, that would be a good start for doing a search analysis, you know, finding words that will resonate. It may be, and I know it's much more complex than that, but it's where what you say and what you search come together. It's where you often find the insight. I mean, a
Hmm.
real insight, not just an
Hmm.
observation.
Hmm. No, I think that's a very good tip. I think for people, because we get a lot of these questions, like how do I go about which question? How should I ask myself a question? It's just a keyword. Where should I start? And I think here
Mm-hmm.
you gave a very good tip on by look at either it can be a, like you say, social media word cloud, but maybe even a survey, like what people have answered in a survey, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And that has been one of the developments I think we've seen in our research kind of portfolio of products is that in addition to asking direct questions, as in a survey, start with what people are saying and talking about to spark the idea. And it's where those two come together that you begin to build insights, observations. Most of what we see labeled as an insight are really just an observation, much as we would find if we we're working in ChatGPT, if nothing
Mm-hmm.
else. But it's when we can bring that together to begin to construct the idea. And the idea may ultimately activate in a number of ways. It may be a promotional activation on the ground, or it may be developing a keyword list to start with.
Mm-hmm.
The most important thing is just to keep an open mind.
How, I mean, in your years, in which markets have you seen that it's hardest to get data on? I mean, because I know you've been working across markets.
Well, a lot of the commercially available third-party data is it is relatively uneven in its distribution. I would say that the most elusive markets are in Asia Pacific. And part of that is while consumers are very, very developed in their use of their online tools, the industry has been very conservative. The advertising media industry has been very conservative. And so, likewise, there are markets that just can't afford it. The CARICOM, Caribbean and Central America area, is another
Mm-hmm.
that they're data limited, if you will, simply because there's not enough critical mass to support third-party research. And so the two things that are available everywhere, because it's consumer-generated research, buzz monitoring and search. And so that signals a shift in how we should be thinking about our research. The big studies, big third-party studies, like a WPP Audience Origins or a TGI or AGB for that matter, or even Nielsen for that matter. The big ones, you need that because it's a large enough sample that you have some stability, even though the macro view that they're giving us of a static study is doesn't really help us reach down to where the insights may be. The fact that the average TV rating worldwide is 1%, more or less,
Mm-hmm.
for a program or a channel, average quarter hour. Well, that's a stability that will help us, but it's the unmeasured in the hard to reach areas that we need to begin to build our understanding. And it's ask the consumer, what is the consumer doing? Because one of the other issues is the big studies, it's expensive to do a big
Yeah.
third party. Now, the other side of that is, of course, the first party. And first party is the ultimate, but there we have some serious data privacy issues and identity issues that have to be respected, seriously, respected. But when you have the opportunity to bring that first and second, not to, and third, second party being where you have an organization that has been very rigorous in collecting information and understanding their consumers and using that to leverage. And that may be one of the bridges, is the second party, what larger organizations who started early and began to understand their consumers. Because it doesn't mean anything unless it comes from the consumer.
Is this something you've seen as a trend, a shift of companies trying to collect more and more first-party data on them, on their consumers and on their
No,
customers?
my it has become increasingly difficult to fund the research part of the business. And while there are heavy investments going into AI, before AI can work its magic, you've got to have that underlayer or foundation of information.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in a very complicated time. From a much simpler standpoint, it's, say, 40 or 50 years ago, when cable TV, wired cable, began to be a factor, there was a disruption because we had measurement of the traditional linear approach to communications, but we did not have really a good measure for the more niche. And
Mm-hmm.
we're there again exponentially.
What are, based on your years now in research and um, market intelligence or what, or insights gathering, what are there any like insights or observations that you have found that for you, I think for me, something I've learned today from you was that there's a meat pie almost everywhere in the world, except I haven't thought about a taco as a meat pie, but you're totally right. And I think, are there any other of those insights or observations that you have seen under the years that have maybe blown you away or made you super
Oh,
sad
going
or
away.
super
Well,
angry?
this is not, it's just an observation, but I don't think we know yet where it will be, even 2 years from now. However, there are some, you know, traditional behaviors in organizations which were developed for good reason, but may not be an effective way to measure our business decisions. You know, a real key one is in the area, not yours, you don't have to worry about this, but competitive analysis. You knew I was going to say that. But competitive is a challenge because in certain circles tends to be on the advertiser client side. They need a simple way of understanding how strong is the competition. And when the set of things we needed to measure was TV, radio, magazines, newspapers, maybe a little out of home, and this is a worldwide issue, you could relatively well rely on a share of investment or a share of voice, that is, share of impressions, eyeballs, and to understand what your relationship. And all credit to Benet and Fields, they have proved that you can still use that mechanism. But the struggle on the ground in the majority of countries is to fill in that unmeasured part. And there are ways to do it, but it's not an absolute number. And it's that misunderstanding by the majority, or maybe it's just the desire to believe in it, that there is a number that tells us true. But the challenge now is we don't know what it is we aren't measuring and the degree to which. And all the research companies, they're doing a great job of expanding the view, but it has fragmented the mechanics of bringing together the data into one number, a
Mm-hmm.
share of investment or a share of
Mm-hmm.
impressions or share of something. But the good news is that whatever you have been able to capture in absolute means very little. But as a share, a relative comparison among your elements, brands, of whatever categories, the relative measure is relatively stable. Okay, we're in the Las Vegas age of advertising and data and analytics. But the more you can capture, the better. And then don't expect it to be absolute. And this is going to be on my tombstone, I'm sure. And be willing to use a relative metric, even if it feels like you're just at the tables in Macau or Las Vegas.
Cynthia, I think one of the things that you have picked up on is that we have been driving, and I know that a lot of less field, especially Les Binet and James Hankins and others, is share of search as another alternative, kind of wrapping around the start of this conversation on using that search data is a very democratic data set in that sense, because you can actually find it everywhere. And in that sense, I think it can help you to answer the question of the relative metric, at least on online markets. And I promised everyone that I always keep the time. Unfortunately, we lost a couple of minutes in the beginning. So, but thank you so much for joining me today, Cynthia. And I'll speak to you all in different channels. And I look forward to speak to other guests. And Cynthia will have to have an offline, I think, and have a longer chat, because it was a long time ago.
Thank you so much. So happy to see you and be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Yes, see you soon.